Professor Anandavardhanan has won many prestigious awards in addition to Bhatnagar Prize, this Young Science Teaching Award from Indian Institute of Technology, Scopus Young Scientist Award. These are the some of awards in the list. Professor Anandavardhanan doing research especially in representation theory, automorphic forms, etc. He has a number of publications in various reputed journals, international journals, and he has enlightened many through his conference talks and invited lectures. It is great honor to all of us to hear from you, sir. Sir, please.
So thank you so much for the invitation, and so thank you all of you, Professor Preeti and all the colleagues in Calicut University. It's indeed a great pleasure for me to participate in this webinar. I hope the connection will be okay, but let's see. Anyway, let's start. Yeah. So I will say a few words and then come to my talk. So since I am from that place, I thought I will say a few words before I get to the content of my talk. So as Professor Prasad also mentioned, I did my BSc in Calicut in Government Arts and Science College, affiliated to Calicut University. But more than that, I am from the university campus. So, so I grew up there. I went to the Rachana Nursery. I went to the Government Model High School on the university campus. So only after that I went to Arts College. And I do come there very frequently, once in 2 months or once in 3 months usually. But of course, this last year has been different, so I have not been there for a year now. But as soon as I come, of course, I will come to the department. And from my school days onwards, I have been to your department. So, in fact, I remember when Fermat's last theorem was proved in 1995, Professor Sivaramakrishnan gave a talk in the department. And I don't know how many of you know him. He was there long ago. And so I went to the department to attend his talk, attend Professor Sivaramakrishna's talk on Fermat's last theorem. Professor Krishna Kumar, whom all of you will know for sure, he's been very close to our family, a close friend of my father's. And so I used to come to the maths department and he used to teach me some mathematics. And because of him only, I went to the University of Hyderabad. Also, connection with University of Hyderabad also starts in the Calicut University Maths Department, because that's where I met Professor Musili, who used to be at the University of Hyderabad when he gave the Kesava Menon endowment lectures in your department. And my PhD advisor, Professor Rajat Tandon, also I met in Calicut University first. He had come to visit the library on as part of some NBHM committee, and that's when Professor Krishna Kumar introduced me to Professor Rajat Tandon. So I can go on and on. So if I continue talking, I will not get into my talk. So let's stop somewhere and let me get to the talk. So I will start sharing the slides. So let us start. So the topic for my lecture today, I have titled that the sign of the Gauss sum. So sign, all of you know, it's either a plus or a minus. So the talk is about plus or minus. So as simple as that. And Gauss sum is something which many of you may know and many of you may not know. I will introduce it. And there's a famous problem due to Gauss. This so-called Gauss sum, how does one fix its sign? So I will take this as a motivating topic, and I will narrate some stories. There will not be any real technical math content in this talk. The point of this talk is to bring your attention to certain interesting themes and number theory in mathematics in general. So I will take this as a story. It will be narrating a story. I will have many storytelling slides, and So that's what I plan to do. And towards the end, maybe since there are college students and all in the audience, I will discuss a particular problem where this sign plays a crucial role. Of course, many more things play a role. It's a difficult, advanced topic finally, but introducing that topic as high school mathematics. So I will do that towards the end. So that will be the talk. So you have a nice title for this webinar, where Ramanujan is involved. So I will start with Ramanujan. Okay, so formally, let me start by thanking Professor Preeti Kuttipulakal and all the other colleagues. And just now I was talking to some of you, and some of you I know very well from other places, like Dr. Mubina, I know very well when she was in IMSC. And everybody is at the University of Calicut for the invitation to speak in this national webinar. So as I was telling, before March 2020, before the lockdown, I used to come there very frequently, and I, always go for coffee to the coffee house at the university bus stand, and I walk via the maths department, via the road in front of the maths department to that circle, and then via the main road in the university campus. So of course, I am looking forward to visiting there again as soon as things are back to normal. Okay, so just to prove that I do work, I mean, most of you will recognize this place. This is right in front of the science departments, right? So this is the botanical garden here, and down here is Vilunial, and up there is the center of the university where the park is there, and this is that road. And this also you will recognize is very next to your department. So I don't know what this building is. This is relatively new. When I was in college, this building was not there. And it's always a place where the sunset is very, very beautiful. So the department must be somewhere here. Okay, so let's start. So as I said, the purpose of this talk is to narrate a few stories from mathematics in an informal way. Okay, so we have Ramanujan in the title, and let me start with Ramanujan. I don't have to say anything about Ramanujan to an audience consisting of mathematicians or to any audience in India. Everyone learns about him in school, and this is Srinivasa Ramanujan, and all of us know these famous letters that he wrote to Hardy. I'm sorry, I think there's some work going on and there's some disturbance, but I hope I'm still audible. So this is Ramanujan's letter to Hardy, the famous letter, and so this is dated Jan 1913, and let's see what he has written here. So he says, I have got theorems on divergent series, theorems to calculate the convergent values corresponding to the divergent series. Theorems to calculate the convergent values corresponding to the divergent series, and he gives some examples. For example, he says 1 minus 2 plus 3 minus 4, etc. etc. So instead of ... I think they used to write etc. And he's giving some finite answer to an obviously infinite sum. And similarly here, 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus etc. He says it is minus 1 by 12. 1 cube plus 2 cube plus etc. He says it is 1 by 120. Of course, these are the answers. This is divergent, right? This is infinity, but he is giving a finite answer. And Hardy understood what Ramanujan had in mind, and so Hardy could recognize the genius of Ramanujan from this. And I mean, this is a long letter. I think this is page 11 or something. There are many pages in this letter, and there were so many beautiful mathematics. And Hardy understood that this is a genius who's writing these letters, and then we know the famous story. So let me start with this thing. So what is 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus etc.? Why is it minus 1 by 12? How do you interpret it to be minus 1 by 12? Yeah. So this is where we stopped. 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus etc. I want to interpret. And the interpretation, many of you will know this, is via the Riemann zeta function. So what is the Riemann zeta function? Riemann zeta function is S is a complex variable, and you take 1 plus 1 by 2 power s plus 1 by 3 power s plus etc. And as all of you know, this may not be convergent everywhere, but it's real analysis. You can check that when real part of S is strictly bigger than 1, this is convergent. And this is something that we do in MSc or maybe in BSc, that when S is bigger than 1, this is convergent. And then there is a way to define by what is called analytic continuation. There is a way to uniquely extend it to all the complex numbers, to the entire complex plane. So having extended it, if you plug in S equal to -1, so S equal to -1, I'm not plugging it in this definition, but I'm plugging it in the analytically continued, meromorphically continued function. If you plug in S equal to -1, you will get a finite value. On the other hand, if you blindly plug in S equal to -1 in this formula, what will you get? It will be 1 by 1 by 2. So that is 2. 1 by 1 by 3, that is 3. So you will get 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus etc. And that value on the analytically continued Riemann zeta function is exactly -1 by 12. So this is how you interpret this to be correct. This is the right-hand side formula for the Riemann zeta function, which makes sense only when S is bigger than 1. But if you blindly put S equal to -1, you will get that infinite sum. And the analytically continued Riemann zeta function, if you plug in S equal to -1, you do get -1 by 12. Okay, so that is the connection with Ramanujan's letter. To continue with the Riemann zeta function, it has what is called a functional equation. So many people will, slightly modify this function. Zeta I have modified to psi. Let's not get into technicalities. It will involve the gamma function and all that. And if you modify it slightly, then it has a remarkable symmetry. And the symmetry is that xi at S and xi at 1 minus S is equal for all S. S is any complex number, and you have this wonderful symmetry. Okay, this is what is called the functional equation for the Riemann zeta function. Let me, for fun, let us just write this as psi is equal to 1 times psi of 1 minus S, right? I mean, I'm just saying that, there is this 1 here which we tend not to see, but I have highlighted it. Okay, so we will say that this 1 is the sign of the functional equation associated to the Riemann zeta function. Okay, and of course I should mention the Riemann hypothesis. All of you know about this, but if there are some school or college students who haven't heard about it, it's one of the most famous problems in mathematics today. And in fact, when the new millennium began in 2000, there was this Clay Mathematics Institute. They said, they announced, they selected 7 problems. A group of mathematicians selected 7 problems and said these are the millennium problems which next century or next 2 centuries people should work on. These are the most important problems in mathematics. And so you can see 7 are there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and Riemann hypothesis is one of them. So this would roughly say that the Riemann zeta function, you can ask where are the zeros of this function. So it's a complex valued, complex variable function. And you can say where does the function vanish, and the conjecture is that the hypothesis is the conjecture is that precisely when real part of S equal to half. S has to be of the form half plus IT. These are the non-trivial zeros. There may be some zeros coming from the gamma function which nobody bothers about. So this is a famous Riemann hypothesis. Okay, so this was in 1859. Riemann was lived during 1826, 1866. So like Ramanujan, he also did not live very long, 40 years. So this was in 1859. So that's a brief introduction to Riemann hypothesis. Of course, the Riemann zeta function was written down and it was studied even before Riemann. We usually say Riemann zeta function because Riemann investigated it more than others, and this is the famous Riemann hypothesis. So in fact, Euler studied this function and gave a product formula for this function, which is basically the fundamental theorem of arithmetic. Okay, so Euler was much before. And Euler gave this product formula in 1737. So this is Euler and this is Riemann. Let me introduce what is called the Dirichlet L function. So Dirichlet is another very famous German mathematician, and it is very, very similar to Riemann zeta function. What you do is, so this is the Riemann zeta function. I change the denominator here. So instead of 1 everywhere, the denominator is the same, but in the numerator, instead of 1 everywhere, I'm writing chi of 2. When denominator is 2, I have written chi of 2. Here I have written chi of 3, etc. What is this function chi? Chi is a homomorphism of this group. So you can take numbers, integers modulo n, modulo arithmetic, and this is a group, and you take the homomorphisms of this group. So modulo n, the units in that ring, that's a group, and you take a homomorphism chi, and you can extend this multiplicatively to the all of z. So it's an arithmetic function. It's a multiplicative function. It's a completely multiplicative function chi, and you, instead of 1 everywhere, you take chi of 2, chi of 3 for any chi. So if chi is identically 1, then this is the answer. It's a slight generalization of the Riemann zeta function, and that also has a functional equation. So remember, Riemann zeta function had this functional equation changing s and 1 minus s. Here also similarly, you modify it slightly, and that has a remarkable symmetry. Lambda of chi is lambda of 1 minus s chi bar. Chi bar is the complex conjugate, which is same as chi inverse. Okay, so s go into 1 minus s, and here, you know, I have put something. So earlier this something was always 1, and here this something will depend upon chi. Okay, and this involves this can be written down, and one factor which goes into the square here is what is called the Gauss sum. So what is the Gauss sum of chi? It is a certain summation where I have put this multiplicative character chi, and this is the exponential function, and this is an additive character, and you are mixing multiplication with addition and summing it up. So there is a certain formula. This is what is called the Gauss sum. So from this slide, what all you need to know is there is the Dirichlet function, which is a generalization of the Riemann zeta function. It has a functional equation, and in the functional equation, one ingredient that goes into it is what is called the Gauss sum, which is explicitly given by some formula. Forget the formula. If you're seeing for the first time, don't bother. There is a Gauss sum associated with this character, and that goes into this functional equation. Is all that you need to remember from this slide. This is Dirichlet. So these are all very famous German mathematicians from what century is this? 1800, meaning 19th century, right? Yeah. Dirichlet, and maybe since I lost some time in between because of LaTeXing, maybe I will skip this. I will just say that Dirichlet was very famous. In fact, someone wrote a recommendation letter for Dirichlet saying, you know, if Dirichlet says something, you can guarantee it is correct. You know, he doesn't make mistakes. That was the kind of prestige that he had. So this Jacobi wrote about Dirichlet, and this quotation is from this very nice book called Mathematics Without Apologies. It's a relatively new book published in 2015 by a very famous mathematician, Michael Harris. You will know so if your library, if the library in your university does not have it, please do get a copy of this into your library.
It's sure.
You have it?
We don't have it.
Yeah, it's a wonderful book, and most of you will enjoy it, and it has a lot of stories and a lot of mathematics also. Very nice book. And all of you will recognize the title, right? The title is related to the famous title of Hardy's autobiography, which is titled The Mathematician's Apology, and Michael Harris is saying we are doing mathematics without apology. Okay. So let's come back to Gauss sum. What is easy to do? So, you know, if this was an MSc class or something, we could have proved it in half an hour. That I define the Gauss sum, and you take the Gauss sum of chi and the Gauss sum of chi inverse, and if you multiply those two, you know, it's a simple manipulation using those using that sum. There will be a double sum, and you will do some manipulation. It's very easy to see what the answer is. So this is very elementary mathematics once you know the definition. If I was teaching a course, MSc or BSc, I would have actually done it on the blackboard. And the answer is chi at -1 times n. N is the n with which we take modulo n, z bond nz. Okay, that is easy. So in particular, if n is a prime number p and chi is such that chi square is 1, you will get that tau chi. So this will be chi square is 1. So this is also chi. So tau chi square is chi of -1 times p. So tau chi will be square root of that. So square root of chi of -1 times square root of p. So in particular, if P is 1 mod 4, it will be plus or minus root P. And if P is 3 mod 4, it is plus or minus I times root P. Because when P is 3 mod 4, chi minus 1 is minus 1. So square root is I plus or minus. And when P is 1 mod 4, the answer is 1. So square root of 1 is plus or minus 1. This much is easy. But what is not so easy is, why do you say plus or minus? Can't you say, is it plus or is it minus? Can't you fix it? That is not so easy. I mean, today it's not so difficult. Again, we could have done it in an MSc class. But those days, right, we are talking about 1800 sometime, and it was a very difficult problem. It's a famously hard problem. In fact, Gauss worked on it for several years. Here is the story. So Gauss remarked, so in 1805, August 30, Gauss wrote in his diary. So I guess this must be Latin or something. Let's not bother about it. Here is a translation. At length, we achieved a demonstration of the very elegant theorem mentioned before in May 1801, which we had sought for more than 4 years with all efforts. So, and Gauss's proof was finally published in 1811. So he apparently worked on it for 4 years. So what was the problem? You know, plus or minus something, you would like to know whether it is plus or minus. Fix the sign. And this he worked for more than 4 years. And the answer is, in both those places, it is a plus. It is not a minus, it is a plus. So this is Gauss's theorem, published in 1811. So in particular, if you put that back in, just like the Riemann zeta function, here also it becomes plus 1. From this result, it follows. Okay, here is one more story about that. So same story. So figuring out the determination of the sign is a more difficult problem. And the conjecture that the plus sign holds in each case was made by Gauss and recorded in his diary. In 1805, Gauss recorded that a proof of the very elegant theorem mentioned in 1801 had finally been achieved. And he wrote to one of his friends that seldom had a week passed for 4 years that he had not tried in vain to prove this conjecture. And finally, when it came all of a sudden, as lightning strikes, was the puzzle solved. And subsequently, you know, there have been so many proofs, and now it's not such a difficult thing. So this quotation is from this book, A Classical Introduction to Modern Number Theory. Okay, so this is Gauss. So our theorem is from 1811, and he had a longish life compared to many other mathematicians that we mentioned, 1777 to 1855. So this is Carl Gauss. Okay, now let me just say a few things. So this is modern mathematics. I myself don't follow what I'm going to say all that well, but I'm supposedly from this area. What all I will say is these kind of questions. So something like the Gauss sum will come in very many areas of mathematics. And this problem that I introduced, the problem due to Gauss, is very typical in the sense, whatever your object is, like Gauss sum, figuring, so whether, you know, the sign coming there is plus or minus is not so difficult to figure out. But what exactly is a sign turns out to be very difficult, and it's a very beautiful and challenging theme in number theory. And one of the names that I can put here is Deligne. Okay, something like the Gauss sum, you know, I mean, it's studied a lot by Deligne. Pierre Deligne. And I will just say that so these Gauss sum like objects, I'm not getting into technical details here, and these kind of objects come in various contexts. It is in algebraic number theory, algebraic geometry, many areas. And just one thing I will say, I mean, just to give you, you know, some words. One of the famous conjectures in the so-called Langlands program these days is what is called the Gane-Gross-Prasad conjectures. And of course, it's a set of conjectures, and there's one aspect of the conjecture where these kind of signs show up, and whether it is a plus or minus is connected to various other questions in number theory and representation theory. So this is just to give, you know, some words so that, you know, some students at least pick up some words with which, you know, they are motivated. So these are conjectures called Gane-Gross-Prasad conjectures, which is a very active area of research today. For example, here is a poster of a summer school in 2014 in Paris, summer school on the Gane-Gross-Prasad conjectures. And in this poster, this is Robert Langlands. So there is what is called the Langlands program, which is broadly speaking my area of research. And it is named after this very famous mathematician, Robert Langlands. And this is Laplace. Okay, here is another poster, this conference 2019, again, recent advances on the Gauss-Poisson conjectures. You will recognize this name, right? Andrew Wiles building. Andrew Wiles is, I mentioned this talk by Professor Sivaramakrishnan I attended in your department when I was in my BSc, and Fermat's last theorem is solved by Andrew Wiles. Okay, so the point of this is, there are many current research themes where something like the Gauss sum and figuring out whether the sign is plus or minus, that question plays a very important role. That's all that I wanted to say with these slides. And since I mentioned these names, here is Gahn, here is Gross, here is Prasad. This is Vitek Gahn, he's in Singapore now. And this is Benedict Gross, who's in the USA. He was at Harvard University. And this is Dipendra Prasad, who used to be at Tata Institute of Fundamental Research. And now he is at my department, IIT Bombay. Okay. So now, so this was the story part of the talk. Okay, of course, I will continue with the story, but with one precise mathematics problem. And as I said at the starting, this is a problem that can be stated and can be understood by a school student. Okay. Yeah, is there a question? Okay, maybe we can take a short break, and if somebody has a question, we can address it and get back to this. So let me see the other window. Yeah, is there any quick question or comment? Let me also see the chats. Nothing there, no? Yeah. Okay, good. So maybe we could continue if there is no question at this point. So what I was saying was that up to now we did not get into any real mathematics, but I narrated the story where a sign played a role, and I said that this kind of questions are part of advanced current research today. And now what I will do is I'll introduce a small problem which can be understood even by school students, but actually working on that problem is very, very difficult modern day mathematics. So I will give again some names at the end, but let me introduce this problem. So even if you haven't followed whatever I have been saying, you can come back to the talk now. It's like a fresh start of this talk. Okay. So the problem that we are going to discuss, this is one of the oldest problems in mathematics. This is looked at by Persian mathematicians of the 10th century, so 1000 years ago. Okay. So if I Google about this problem, about the history of the problem, two names that frequently come up. One is Al-Khazin, and he lived during these years, and Al-Karaji. So these are Iranian mathematicians. Okay, and there's this historian of mathematics, also a mathematician. He said that this problem has become a favorite topic of lectures for a wider audience. So most mathematicians, if they are asked to give a talk meant for college students or school students, a lot of them will choose this problem because this problem is easy to introduce. On the other hand, you can also discuss a lot of modern mathematics by focusing on this problem. So it has become a favorite topic of lectures, and I'm also choosing the same thing. Okay, and it's called the conjugate number problem. So what is this conjugate number in the title? Some of you may know, some of you may not know. Let me introduce it. Okay, so it's about natural numbers, 1, 2, 3, etc. And if you have a natural number, it is called conjugate. So the definition is the next line. It is the area of a right triangle. So one angle is 90 degrees. So it's a right triangle. And this number has to be obtained as the area of a right triangle. But what is the property of this right triangle? It's not any right triangle, but all the three sides of this right triangle should be rational numbers. Okay, P by Q. So if you have a right triangle and all the three sides are rational numbers, and you calculate the area half dh, base times height by 2, and if the area happens to be this number, natural number, then that natural number is called conjugate, otherwise not. Okay, example, the most famous Pythagorean triple, 3, 4, 5. What is the area of this triangle? So this is a right angle triangle. And what is the area? Half times 3 times 4. So 2 times 3, 6. So therefore 6 is a conjugate number. And if you consider this Pythagorean triple, that's again 5 square plus 12 square is 13 square. It's a Pythagorean triple. So this is a right triangle. What is the area? Half times 5 times 12. So 6 times 5, 30. So 30 is an example of a conjugate number. 5 and 7 are also conjugate numbers, but already it's not so obvious what right triangle I can give so that 5 will be the area. What right triangle I can give so that 7 will be the area. Okay, so I have copied it from the internet. If you consider this particular right triangle, you can check that Pythagoras theorem is true, therefore it's a right triangle, and you can check the area. Area turns out to be 5, so 5 is a right triangle. Similarly, 7 is also a right triangle. And here is a precise rational sides of one such triangle whose area is 7. Okay. So already you can see some difficulty in this problem. 5 is conjugate, but showing that 5 is conjugate was not so obvious. Some calculations were required, but 6 is conjugate was very easy. So there is something like this. Anyway, so as you can see, showing that something is conjugate might involve some computer or some, some calculations. So what I will do is I'll just copy, but of course, all these things are studied very well. So I've just copied all the conjugate numbers below 100 from the internet. Okay, so I just copy paste it. There's this famous website where many famous integer sequences are listed, and this is a list of conjugate numbers below 100. So 5 is conjugate, 6 is conjugate, 7 is conjugate, 8 is not, 9 is not, 10 is not, 11 is not, 12 is not, 13 is, up to 96. And after 96, the next one is above 100. Okay. So you can see many numbers are conjugate, many numbers are not. Okay. So these are the numbers which can be obtained as the area of a right triangle, all whose sides are rational numbers, and the other numbers you cannot obtain like that. And this is where this is copied from. And this is an easy exercise that if a number is conjugate, if and only if any square multiple of that number is conjugate. For example, 5 is conjugate. So if you multiply by a square, let us say 4 times 5, 20 is also there. If you multiply by 9, 9 times 5, 45, 45 is also there. Okay, so similarly, if and only if it's very easy. I mean, if you think about it within half a minute, you can solve this. Okay, you can think about it later. So we can as well focus on square-free positive integers, because if there is a square, you can take it out and study the square-free part. I just want to exhibit that this can get very, very difficult. For example, it is not.
Yeah, sir, there is a question in the chat box. One asking, sir, what is congruent?
So what is congruent, right? So let me go back to that slide. Congruent is the definition. Okay. So I'm calling a number to be a congruent number. A number is called congruent. This is the definition. If it is the area of a right triangle with the property that all the 3 sides of that right triangle are rational numbers. Is it clear? So you take a triangle, right triangle with all 3 sides having lengths rational numbers, and see what the area is. And if the area is a natural number, then that natural number is congruent. This is the definition. And I gave you examples. 5, 6 is congruent because if you take this triangle 3, 4, 5 as the sides, base, height, and hypotenuse, the area is 6. So 6 is congruent. I hope it's clear now. Okay, so some numbers are congruent, some numbers are not. So for example, so the point of this slide is that, this can get computationally very difficult. For example, 157 is a congruent number. The number 157 is a congruent number, but the simplest rational right triangle with area 157, these are its sides. So these are, it's not so big numbers, but both the numerator and denominator are very big numbers, right? So roughly, some 25 to 30 digits are there in the numerator and denominator. So of course, as you can imagine, a lot of computations will be required, a lot of computer help will be required. So the simplest right triangle that one can write down, whose area is 157, these are the 3 sides, base, height, and hypotenuse. Okay, So this was done by Zagier in 1981. And Norm Elkis in 1982 similarly showed 1063. I hope you can see my cursor here, cursor moving, 1063. That is also a congruent number, but the simplest rational right triangle with area 1063 has sides so big that, you know, I can't write it down here. It will have the shortest side has a numerator which has 104 digits. So this is like 30 digits. So 3-4 times this. So it's really big.
Sir, there are few more questions.
Yes, please. Should I go to the chat box or will you ask the question?
Yes. I can read, sir.
Yeah, please.
What is conjecture?
What is?
Conjecture.
Conjecture. Okay. So conjecture. Okay. So yeah. So conjecture means in your textbook or in your class you would have seen words like theorem, lemma, proposition, etc. Right? So these are all proved results. Some things are called theorem, some things are called lemma. I don't know what is called a theorem and what is called a lemma, but these are proved results, right? You will state something, then you will say, let us begin the proof, then you will have some logical arguments, and then you will say, the proof is finished. But conjecture is something which the person who proposes it thinks it should be true, but there is no proof. We don't know for sure whether it is true or not. I'm quickly thinking what is the Malayalam word for this. But you know, I mean, usually, you know, many things my Malayalam is quite good, but immediately I'm not getting the word for conjecture. But conjecture is this: it's like a hypothesis. It is what I believe to be true, but there is no proof. So someone else in future may prove my statement, in which case it will become a theorem, or one might disprove it, in which case my conjecture turns out to be false. I hope it's clear. Okay, so that's it.
One Mr. Mallaya asked that, and
Yeah.
he also, for this, if you discuss with an example.
The word conjecture.
Yeah.
Okay, so let us take okay, one of the most famous examples. Let's go back. Okay, so I said there is this famous Riemann hypothesis, and I said there are all these famous problems. So you see, the first one is called the BSD conjecture. So as you can guess, all these are conjectures, because these are all statements which, you know, people are working on. There is no proof. So this is what is called the Bird-Swinnerton conjecture, which is still not proved. And there is something in algebraic geometry called the Hodge conjecture. So Hodge thought a certain statement and he thought it should be true, but there's no proof. So that is a conjecture. Navier-Stokes is also a conjecture from partial differential equations. There's what is called the famous Navier-Stokes equations, and it's about, you know, the regularity of the solution. So it's a very, very difficult problem in fluid dynamics, turbulence. So that's also a conjecture, though the word is not there. P equal to NP is again a question coming from, you know, complexity theory in theoretical computer science, whether something can be done in polynomial time, etc., etc. And that's also a question mark. P equal to NP and a question mark. So is P NP or is P not NP? That's also a conjecture. Hypothesis is also something like a conjecture. Yang-Mills, that's a conjecture. And to explain Malaya's second question with an example, let's come to the last one. Poincare conjecture is a conjecture from geometry, from manifolds, from differential geometry. Okay, or you can say topology, broadly geometry topology. And this was a conjecture in 2000, but today it is not a conjecture. So what does that mean? That means it got proved, and it got proved, and this was a very famous result. So Poincare conjecture, the proof of Poincare conjecture due to this famous mathematician Perelman. So Perelman proved this roughly when, in 2006, he was offered a Fields Medal, which he refused to accept. So this was proved a few years before that. So exactly, I don't remember. You can Google, maybe 2004 or something, because 2006 he was awarded the Fields Medal. Okay, so this is an example of a conjecture which is not a conjecture today. And similarly, you know, the Fermat's last theorem that I mentioned, nobody called it a conjecture. It was always called Fermat's last theorem, though actually it was a conjecture till Andrew Wiles proved it in 1995. So these are examples. These are the famous examples. But anything that I can think of today, I can say it's of course, I should have some belief in it. I should have some examples, some reason to believe. Otherwise, I will not call something a conjecture. And okay, I can talk about this also. These conjectures also, in many cases, these are proved now. So I haven't said that. So these are very modern day conjectures. So conjectures were proposed maybe in 1990s and further generalizations more recently. And some of these conjectures are proved now by some French mathematicians. Okay, so these are examples.
Okay, sir, I think it's clear. The same question was raised by Soumendra Dey. Same question.
I hope that
one more question is there.
Yeah.
Is there any process to find a number congruent or not?
Yeah, so that is a part of the talk. So we are going to see the story. So
Yeah, one more is sir.
Yeah.
Okay, sir, please can explain any Ramanujan conjecture.
Okay, so Ramanujan conjecture is another, yeah, so I could have said that as an example. Ramanujan conjecture, so I don't know how many Ramanujan conjectures are there, so without him mentioning which conjecture, I'm not sure. But today there is a very famous Ramanujan conjecture, and so it's not so easy for me to explain without, something being written down. And it is not coming in my slides. But roughly, since the question came, I'm happy the question came. Roughly speaking, okay, so it's not in the slide. So there are these modular forms, these objects called modular forms. In fact, you know this because it came in Professor Kalyan Chakrabarty's talk yesterday. You must have seen what is called a modular form. And Ramanujan studied these modular forms. And there is this famous Ramanujan delta function, which is one of the most basic examples of a modular form, and it will have what is called the Fourier expansion, and it has the Fourier coefficients, and he studied those Fourier coefficients, what is called the tau function, and he proposed. It would have been nice if he had the slides, because the way he proposed from some minimal computations that he has done is really fantastic. So he proposed three things about the Fourier coefficients. And the first two, so all these were conjectures, though he didn't call them conjectures, but they were conjectures. And the first two got proved quite easily. So one would say that the tau function is completely multiplicative. Tau of mn is tau of m times tau of n, where m and n are natural numbers, and tau is the coefficient of the Ramanujan delta function. That got proved maybe within a few decades. And then there was a product formula which also got proved. And then there was a third part of this conjecture which gave an estimate for the Ramanujan tau function. So if you take a prime number p and if you evaluate tau of p and you take the absolute value, and he said it should be less than twice p power 11 by 2, something very precise. So twice p power 11 by 2. That should be a bound for the Ramanujan tau function at t. This was there in his notes maybe. And this was proved. Okay, so good that you asked who proved this. So this was a conjecture for so many years. It was one of the most difficult conjectures in mathematics. And this is proved by this mathematician, Pierre Delisle. Okay. So it is not quite related to why I quoted him here, but it is proved by this mathematician. And I mentioned Poincaré conjecture and Perelman and Fields medal. Pierre Delisle is also a Fields medalist. He got the Fields medal for proving the Ramanujan conjecture. Okay, so so that's an example. And I also said that there is a Ramanujan conjecture which is still not proved, which is a generalization of this Ramanujan conjecture. But that is much more advanced, and there is a version of that which is not proved, but that was not originally conjectured by Ramanujan. So this can also happen in mathematics. Ramanujan conjectured something, and there may be an obvious generalization which other people have come up with, but that will still be called Ramanujan conjecture because it is related to the original conjecture. Okay, so any other question?
Okay, sir, that's all.
Okay, so let's continue. And actually, since the question came and since I said certain things, which I was not prepared to talk about, maybe it's a good idea to just double check on some things that I have said, or you can do it later. But let's just see whether what I said is mostly correct. Okay. Pierre Deline.
Anand,
Yeah.
tau is multiplicative, not completely multiplicative.
I used the word completely multiplicative. So
Yeah.
Sir, Srinivas sir.
This is Srini.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
It is multiplicative. So multiplicative meaning tau of m tau of m times tau of n when m and n are co-prime. When m and n are co-prime. So very important. Completely multiplicative meaning always tau of m tau of m times tau of n. Multiplicative is when m and n are co-prime, and that is true. That is a conjecture. Thank you so much. Yeah. So this is the Ramanujan. Okay, so here it is called Ramanujan-Petersen conjecture. So this is the. I hope you can see this. This is the conjecture, and I just wanted to verify about Deline. Yeah. So the third statement followed from the proof of, yeah. So Deline proved something much more, what is called the Weyl conjectures, and this proves, and the year is 1974. So it's fine. Okay. Okay. All right. So let's keep going. So if there is another question, you can ask me similarly. We were here. Yeah, and I also said, computationally these things can get very difficult. And so let's see. So the non-congruent numbers from the list we know 1, 2, 3, 4 are not congruent. But how do you prove that something is not congruent? Something is, finally, if you can exhibit a right angle triangle, then you are done. But something is not, how do you do? Because whatever you try, it may not work, but that doesn't mean nothing will work. No, so it requires an argument. It requires a mathematical argument. So since I took some time elsewhere, maybe I will skip this by giving you references where you can see these things. These are not difficult. So 1 is not congruent, 2 is also not congruent. This was proved long ago. And the only thing that I will say is this requires a very ingenious argument. Though it's elementary now, it's quite ingenious. And so the observation is 1 is congruent if and only if this equation y square plus 1 equal to x power y square plus 1 equal to x power 4, this has a rational solution. And that is easy because if there is a solution to the right angle triangle area problem, then you will get some manipulation, some algebra manipulation, and you will get a solution for this. Other way also you can do. So let's not get into the details. These are some things that you can verify. In fact, I did not verify it myself. I just took it from somewhere. But these are when someone gives you the answer, verifying it is obvious. And then similarly for 2, let us skip 2. And therefore the problem was brought down to this question: a Pythagorean triangle cannot have any two of its sides. The sides are either a square or twice a square. So it was brought down to a problem about Pythagorean triangles, and this is the name Fermat. Fermat proved that this is not possible. So let's not get into the detail, but I have the details here, and I have copy pasted these details from the Wikipedia entry. So what I suggest is either these slides are available later and you can look at this, but do go through this. Very easy. There's nothing difficult here. But the point is, otherwise you can Google. What you have to Google is Fermat's infinite descent. This is the term, infinite descent. And you will go to the Wikipedia page, and this is exactly from Wikipedia. So what is done here is, if there is a right angle triangle with this property, if there is so congruent number problem for 1 and 2 is brought down to a problem about right angle triangles. And if there is a right angle triangle which has two sides, either a square or twice a square, if you assume that, without loss of generality, you can assume those are integers, and you can write down a Pythagorean triple like this. And what this is doing is, If you have such a right angle triangle, then it is producing a smaller such right angle triangle. There are 3 cases, but in each of those cases, if x comma y comma z is, you know, a right angle triangle, and if x and z are squares, then you know you are getting another right angle triangle with smaller sides where there are 2 squares. If x is a square and y is square or twice a square, then you have brought down, you know, a smaller right angle triangle where x is a square and y is a square or twice a square. Yeah, you can check that yeah, you can check from here that, you know, y equal to 2ab, and if y is a square or twice a square, you can check that this also has the same property. It has, you know, square or twice a square. So in all these 3 cases, you are bringing down to a smaller right triangle. So this is the infinite descent method. You start with something, assume there is a solution, then you are getting a smaller such thing with the same solution, and this process can be continued infinitely, and that's a contradiction, because finally, you know, I mean, if you're working with natural numbers, you cannot go smaller and smaller because there is a smallest natural number. You know, it's something similar to, you know, your standard proof in school that root 2 is irrational. Okay, so this is called the method of infinite descent, and you can go here and read all the details. So this is how it was proved that 1 is not conjugate and 2 is not conjugate. This is Fermat. And already to show that 3 is not conjugate, it requires, you know, some more advanced mathematics. And the key word is elliptic curves. Okay, so this is much more modern mathematics. There are these objects called elliptic curves, and in order to study this problem, conjugate number problem, you are naturally led to elliptic curves. So let me just say, without getting into all the technicalities, roughly what these are, and continue the story. So an elliptic curve is a cubic curve of this form: y square equal to x cube plus ax plus b. You can take over any field. We are taking over rational numbers because this is about number theory. A and b are rational numbers, and you need some technical condition, what is called a non-singular curve, etc. Forget all that. Okay, so this is some curve like this. So if you draw such a curve, it will be something like this. Okay, typical elliptic curve will look like this. Now what you have to observe is, this is not just a curve. You know, this curve has many nice algebraic properties. So this is what is called a this can be, the points here can be made into a group, like, you know, integers. You can take 2 natural numbers, you can take 2 integers, you can add, you will get an integer, you can subtract, you will get, you know, it's what's called a group. So how do you do that? If you take 2 points on this elliptic curve, let us say P and Q, you draw a line joining P and Q. So straight line joining P and Q. Because it's a cubic curve, it will meet the curve somewhere else. Okay, it could be, you know, it could be meeting itself also. I mean, it could be a tangent also, but generally a generic straight line will meet it, you know, at some other point, and you fix one point and reflect along that, and you will get another point. This is what is called a point at infinity, and reflect it, and this you define. So this is your definition. This you define as a sum of these 2 points. Okay, and now, you know, you take, you know, if this is a point, this is another point, x1, y1, x2, y2, you write down the coordinate geometry, right? Write down the equation for the straight line, and you can find out what the intersection is. You can find out this. So this is basic coordinate geometry. If you have 2 points, and if s is a slope, you can find out the slope, depending on it's a tangent or a genuine line meeting at 2 points. And you can write down the equation for the final point that we have got, and this will be the x coordinate and this will be the y coordinate. So this is just coordinate geometry, nothing else. But what you observe is, if x1 and x2 are real numbers, then this will be a real number, s will be a real number, and this will be a real number. If x1 and y1 are real numbers, this is also a real number, because everything is, you know, plus, minus, etc., and division, etc., product, division. So it will be among real numbers. If x1 and x2 are rational numbers, then this will be a rational number, this will be a rational number, and this will be a rational number. So the conclusion from the formula for addition, coordinate geometry, is
ഞാൻ സാറിനെ വിളിച്ചിട്ടുണ്ടായിരുന്നു. അപ്പൊ സാറ് പറഞ്ഞത് ഈ ഇഷ്യൂ ആണ്, 2 കമ്മ്യൂണിറ്റി ഒരു ഓപ്പൺ എന്നുള്ളതിലേക്ക് മാറി.
Once again, I couldn't get the question. Should I go to the chat box? Is it here? No, it's not here. So please repeat the question.
No, sir, I don't think that was a question.
Okay.
Some disturbance.
What was the comment?
No, I was unknowingly coming something. So you proceed, sir.
Okay. Fine. Yeah. So the point of this slide is, if P has rational coordinates and Q has rational coordinates, from the coordinate geometry formula for P plus Q, we know that P plus Q also have rational coordinates. What does that mean? It is x comma y. X is a rational number, y is a rational number. Okay. So that means if you take points with rational coordinates, they also form a group. Okay, so if you take points with real coordinates, they form a group. If you take points with rational coordinates, they form a group, etc. So points with rational coordinates on elliptic curves, what are called rational points on elliptic curves, it's a very, very important area of number theory. Very advanced area, where it's a current research area. Okay, so that's all that I have said there. And why am I suddenly talking about elliptic curves? Because this is related to conjugate numbers. And why am I talking about conjugate numbers? Because it's related to sign of the Gauss sum. Okay, it's related to a certain sign. So I'm coming to the sign now. If you have an elliptic curve, forget the technicality here. There is a function like the Riemann zeta function from my first slide, like the Dirichlet function from my second or third slide. A similar function can be written down for an elliptic curve. How we write it down, I'm not getting into the detail. There's a way to write down, and that also has a remarkable symmetry. Earlier, you had S going S and 1 minus S. Now, for an elliptic curve, it is 2 minus S. And there's a symmetry, and there is, that square bracket coming here. And what one knows is it will be either a plus 1 or a minus 1. It will be either a plus 1 or a minus 1. What figuring out is very, very difficult. Okay, it depends on your curve E. But one thing we can observe, suppose that this is a minus 1. Suppose it is minus. Suppose you are in a situation where the curve that you have chosen, I think there's some disturbance because some people haven't muted maybe. If there's a way to mute everybody, then that will be useful. Otherwise, people can mute themselves. Unless there's a question. So suppose it is a minus 1, then let us see what happens. Then you will get lambda of S equal to minus of lambda of 2 minus S. And now let us plug in S equal to 1. So 2 minus 1 is 1. So lambda of 1 equal to minus of lambda of 1. So if something equal to minus of something, what does that mean? That something is 0, right? Lambda of 1 equal to lambda of minus 1, equal to minus of lambda of minus 1. So lambda of 1 is 0. And this is interesting because one of the other conjectures that I stated, the 7 conjectures, the Millennium Problems of Clay Mathematics Institute, one was called BSD, that meant Birch and Swinnerton-Dyer. Okay, so the famous Birch and Swinnerton-Dyer conjecture is about elliptic curves, and it would say that if the corresponding function vanishes at 1, meaning at 0, at 1 it has a 0, it is a root, 1 is a root of this function, 1 is a 0 of this function, then the corresponding elliptic curve will have many, many rational points. Rational point meaning a point with both the x and y coordinates are rational numbers. So that is part of the conjecture. So Birch is one mathematician and Swinnerton-Dyer is another mathematician. It's not Swinnerton and Dyer, it's a hyphenated name. Swinnerton-Dyer is another mathematician. And it's another very famous conjecture which is still not solved. So this will also be a good example for Malaya's question about what is a conjecture. Okay. So So if the answers, if it has a 0 at 1, then such curves will have lots of rational points. And why is it interesting for us? So the point here is whether it is plus or minus is going to have a lot of consequences in other areas. Okay, about elliptic curves, it says something. So whether elliptic curves will have lots of rational points or not, bit of that content is hidden in this sign. So sign plays a very important role. And let's come back to congruent numbers. So I said this, right? These are the millennia problems, and earlier I highlighted Riemann hypothesis, and now I'm highlighting BSD conjecture. So one of them is Birch and the other is Swinnett and Dyer. And this is again from the Claymath Institute website. So these are all very, very famous problems still unsolved. As I said earlier, only this one is solved. Poincaré conjecture is solved. All the other 6 are still unsolved. Okay, so it's quite elementary to see how this is related to congruent numbers. What you are doing, what you're taking here is an elliptic curve, right? What was an elliptic curve for us? It is of the form y square equal to x cube plus ax plus b. So I'm taking a to be minus n square and b to be 0. So this is an example of an elliptic curve, and you take points on that elliptic curve, x comma y satisfying this equation. And here you have ABC such that this is a right angle triangle with area equal to n. So here is this n, and that n is coming here as n square. And there is a dictionary, there is a bijection between them. For example, if you know n is a congruent number, if n is a congruent number, then you know that there are a and b and c rational numbers. A square plus b square is c square. Pythagoras theorem is true, and half ab is that n. Okay, if there is such coordinates which gives you the area n, then you take nd by c minus a and 2n square by c minus a. You plug this in here, you will see that that satisfies this elliptic curve, this equation. Okay, the other way, if you take x comma y here, if you take x comma y here, you can take these 3 coordinates and you can plug in here, you will see that this is satisfied. So if a and b and c are rational, then of course these 2 are rational. And if x and y are rational, of course these 3 are rational. So if you have a rational point on this particular elliptic curve, then that shows that n is congruent. I'm taking y not equal to 0, so that division by y makes sense. So if there is a rational coordinate with y non-zero, y coordinate non-zero, then the corresponding n is congruent. On the other hand, if n is congruent, then there is a rational coordinate on this elliptic curve. So whether a number is congruent or not is by this dictionary related to the problem of this elliptic curve having solutions. And this elliptic curve having solutions is related to its corresponding L function at least one way. If in the L function, if the sign is -1, then you know there are lots of solutions. So what is the conclusion from these slides? If you assume this conjecture, it's not a theorem, it's a conjecture. If you assume this conjecture, and if your elliptic curve, suppose somehow you can compute the sign, and if the sign is a -1, then by this conjecture it will have lots of rational points, and if it has lots of rational points, then it is a congruent number. So this was another question which I said, you know, I cannot answer it so easily, but that is a part of the talk. So in particular, if at least for so many numbers, you can conclude that they are congruent numbers. If you take the corresponding elliptic curve and if you can compute its sign, and if the sign is -1, you can conclude that this n is congruent, and this can be done. Okay, so in particular, there are, so here there is a group law. If there is one solution, you can add those points and you can get another solution. Similarly, if there is one triangle which gives you that n as an area, there are so many triangles which give you that n as that area. So that is a theoretical conclusion from this slide. Given 2 such triangles, we can produce a third such. Let's leave that technical point. So in particular, Birch-Swinnett and Dyer conjecture implies any number n of the form 5 modulo 8, 6 modulo 8, and 7 modulo 8. These are congruent numbers. Okay, and this the conjecture would imply. Why is that? And this is the congruent number problem. What I'm calling the congruent number problem is what are the these numbers are always congruent. Okay, and this is the conjugate number problem. It is still unsolved, but a lot of it is solved. And that will be the last slide, current research, and then we will stop there. Okay, so this is a conjugate number problem. So this is still unsolved, and this is one of the oldest open problems because this was posed 1,000 years ago and it's still open. But if you assume BSD, if you assume the conjecture, suppose the conjecture is true, then the conjugate number problem is solved. Why is that? Because for this elliptic curve, which is coming in the conjugate number problem, you can show that the corresponding sign is a minus and not a plus if you take a number which is 5 mod 8 or 6 mod 8 or 7 mod 8. That is not very difficult. Not very, very easy, but not very difficult. This must have been observed in 1960s or sometime. Okay. So if you have n as 8k plus 5 or 8k plus 6 or 8k plus 7, 5 mod 8 or 6 mod 8 or 7 mod 8, then you can take the corresponding elliptic curve and you can figure out the sign, and the sign turns out to be a minus. So if you are willing to believe the Bird-Swinnerton-Dyer conjecture, the corresponding L function vanishes at 1, and by that dictionary that I wrote down, you can produce right angle triangles with n as the area, and the conjugate number problem is done. So it is not done because BSD is still a conjecture, it is not proved. Okay, but the big breakthroughs, as you can see, important results are happening even now. These are some names associated to big breakthroughs in this problem, in the conjugate number problem. 1952, Kurt Heegner. 1994, famous British mathematician Roger Heath-Brown. 2014, A. Tian from China. And 2016, Alexander Smith, when he made this big breakthrough. Since I understand a lot of students are here in the audience, I should say that in 2016, when Alexander Smith made this big breakthrough, Alexander Smith was an undergraduate student. He was a DS student. He hasn't even started his PhD. He was an undergraduate student when he made this big breakthrough. And then he joined Harvard University for his PhD, and he finished his PhD just now in April 2020. Okay, and there's another breakthrough in 2020 by Daniel Chris. So finally, this particular thing is a screenshot of Alexander Smith's PhD thesis at Harvard University, and you can see the date. It is submitted after our lockdown. Okay, April 2020, he submitted his thesis, and he says that by putting together, Daniel Chris results, etc. So this is the latest in this field. If you take a number which is congruent to 1 mod 8 or 2 mod 8 or 3 mod 8, chances are that they are not congruent. So 0% are congruent numbers. And if you take 5 mod 8 or 6 mod 8 or 7 mod 8, what was the result? What was the problem? The conjecture is that if you take a number which is 5 mod 8 or 6 mod 8 or 7 mod 8, it is congruent. And what is the current status? What is proved is 100% are congruent. Now this might confuse some of the students, and let me just say that 100% does not mean everything, because you're dealing with an infinite set. So there's a technical meaning of 100%. It is probability. Probabilistically, if you randomly pick a number which is 5 mod 8 or 6 mod 8 or 7 mod 8, it should be congruent, but that doesn't mean everything is congruent. I mean, everything is supposed to be congruent. That is what we believe in, but that is not yet proved. Okay. And similarly, 0% is congruent does not mean nothing of this form is congruent. There are examples, which is 1 mod 8, 2 mod 8, 3 mod 8, which are congruent, but the point of 0% is these are sparse. These happen very, very rarely. And what is proved is this almost always happens, and what is believed is this should always happen, not just almost always, always. So this is a current research, and here is a computational table which I have took the screenshot from a paper in a journal called Experimental Mathematics. So this also I would like to stress, since there are so many students in mathematics also we need to do experiments. So some people know how to do these experiments, and something ranging from 1 to 20 million, 2 crores, 20 million, right? 7 zeros here. And there's a table here. I think maybe I have already taken so much time. So let me not explain what the table is. This is from a paper by Nick Rogers. If there is a question, I will come back to this table. Otherwise, let's stop here. So this is my last slide. And I hope I have conveyed, just to summarize, I started with this famous problem of fixing the sign. I told you some stories about Gauss. Then I had 1 or 2 slides about modern mathematics saying similar objects and similar sign is very important in modern mathematics, including in my research area in the Lagrange program. And then I narrated this basic problem called the conjugate number problem from 1000 years ago. And then I told you how modern research in that problem is happening, where elliptic curves come in, and where these famous conjecture of Birch and Swinnerton come in, and how fixing a sign is related to these problems. And let's stop there. Yeah. So what is system of simultaneous congruences? Okay, so that's a different topic because see, I have used the word congruent in a technical sense, which I have explained. But of course, the word congruence is used as A is congruent to B mod C, etc. in our school. That is a different meaning. So that's not related to this. So there is a message, share this topic, or maybe the meaning is share the slides so that the organizers can do. If there is a way of sharing the slides or sharing the talk, you could do that. I have no problem.
What is system of simultaneous congruences?
Yeah, so I saw that already, and that's when I mentioned that that is a different thing. So congruences, in school and college, we would study A congruent to B modulo C. That means A minus B is divisible by C. But that is something different. That is not related to word congruent that I said in this talk, which I have written. And simultaneous congruence, I would assume one would say that there are several congruence relations together. So A1 is congruent to B1 not C, A2 is B2 not C, must be. That must be simultaneous congruence.
Ravi Kumar, you want to ask something?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, okay.
Ma'am, I want to ask to the sir that what is the best approach to solve such a great enigma of mathematics? What is the elementary level that we should youngers do that we can able to solve such a great problem which is given by CMI? So what is the best way to start? Because we youngster also wants to do that, and only foreigner means out of our country solve such kinds of conjecture. Means last time we see the pioneer conjecture proved by the Russian mathematician. Actually, I forget the name, but he's yeah. So what is the best approach, sir? Just a simple question I have.
Yeah. So the only place where I will differ with you, Ravi Kumar, is that it's not simple at all. It's the most difficult question that you have asked. And I have to answer to this. Only thing that I can say is, by the way, it's not true that there are not, I mean, the names that I mentioned happen to be foreigners. But there are
only there is a two mathematician. One comes from Jaipur. Actually, one who is the tabla player also. He also solved the problem.
Yeah, I think you have a name Bhargava.
Manjul Bhargava, yes, sir. And one who is solved the elliptical curve, and actually I forget the one of that mathematician name is also. He also get a field medals also.
Yes. Maybe you have in mind the name of Akshay Venkatesh.
Yes, sir. You are absolutely right, sir.
These are Indian names, but they are not from India in some sense. But it is also true that there are many good work
from India
happening from the country also. But these are technical things, so it depends on the area, it depends on the talk. So it so happened that in my talk, Indian contributions did not come so much, though Ramanujan came, and though this Gangadhar Prasad conjectures came, though just as a way of mentioning, not getting into details. But there are many other things happening. I mean, it's not correct for me to name names without a context, so I will not do that. But there are so much good work happening here. But your main question was, how does one approach? I wish I knew. I wish I knew the answer. So only thing that one can say is, what this particular problem that I talked about, what does it philosophically illustrate to us? one thing that it illustrates to us is, though the problem is simple to state and it is about Pythagoras theorem and Pythagorean triples, you saw that soon, right? I had the slide about 157 where, the right angle triangle had these big numbers, right?
Yes, yes.
So what it tells you is that sometimes, the elementary approach is not enough. And finally, we saw, all these great progresses recently happening. So what are they doing? They are not attacking the problem directly. What they are doing is they are working towards the Birch-Swinnerton conjecture in elliptic curves. So what philosophically we could perhaps conclude is some of these elementary questions. Of course, one can try to attack an elementary question elementarily. If it works well, good, you are happy, it has worked. But if it doesn't work, it's possible that some of these things are connected to deeper mathematics, advanced mathematics, modern research mathematics. And if such a connection is there, it is perhaps we should take the point of view that advances in this modern research may be important to solve these problems. See, the problems can be deceptive. They may look deceptively simple. So we may be cheated that, okay, this looks like an exercise or this looks like an, BSc problem, but maybe it's not. And so the advice, okay, I'm nobody to advise, but one thing that we can all learn from this kind of examples, Fermat's last theorem is another example. Such a simple to state problem, but after all, it took 300 years and a lot of advances in modern mathematics in order to solve such a simple little problem. And so what we could tell ourselves is that whatever we are learning, if you are in BSc or MSc or PhD or whatever, we should pick up as much mathematics as we can. So suppose I do number theory, that doesn't mean I don't do algebra or I don't do geometry or I don't do topology or I don't do partial differential equations. I should do, whatever is there in my studies. I should do all these. I should try to do all of these because all these things are connected, and that's what this is telling us.
Okay, sir.
The only general advice would be to
Yes,
study
we have
as much as
all those
possible.
things applying the different aspect.
Say that again, Ravi Kumar.
We have to study all those things and try to solve that things.
Yeah,
Means we have to.
basic advice is the same. I mean, whether it's in mathematics or physics or chemistry or literature or music, the advice is the same. Work hard, study well.
Okay, sir. Thank you very much, sir.
Yeah.
Hi, Anand. This is Srini again.
Hi. Nice to meet you.
Hi. Yeah. It was a nice talk.
Thank you.
And let me tell the audience that
Yeah.
the speaker himself is a very, very accomplished mathematician.
No, please
So you're
don't.
looking for mathematicians from India, and you're listening to a talk by a famous mathematician. Okay, I mean, recently has been awarded, one of the most prestigious one. So yeah, I would like to add that the students who are interested in mathematics, they should also attend some programs like MTTS programs and other training programs where mathematics is taught at ground level, grassroots level. Okay, so that you develop some passion. If you have passion, you develop more interest and enthusiasm, and also you interact with people. This program, for example, can be taken as a platform to know some speakers. So you be in touch with those people. Okay, continue it. It's not a one-day job or 2 days job. It's a continuous process. So I really thank the organizers also for inviting Anand. I mean, Anand, who is a very good friend of mine. So it was a nice talk. Yeah, good.
Thank you. Since Professor Srinivas mentioned this, let me also add one or two personal remarks to this. He mentioned two things. If you paid attention, he mentioned two things. One is programs like MTTS, and I should say that I met Professor Srinivas. I don't know whether he remembers this, first time in MTTS. And this was in 1998 in IIT Madras. So I met Professor Srinivas for the first time in MTTS. That's how I got to know him. And of course, then we are in the same area of number theory. So So we happens to meet in various conferences. The very last being in Calicut. We met in Calicut just last year in KSOM. Professor Kalyan Chakrabarty inaugurated, was there yesterday and he's there tomorrow. He's the director there now. And the last time we met just before the lockdown was in Calicut. Thank you, Srinivas.
Sir,
I remember. Of course, I remember.
sir, what is the full form of MTTS? Actually, I just
Mathematics Training and Talent Search Program, MT and TS, Mathematics Training and Talent Search. Okay. So the other thing I wanted to mention was this is a program supported by National Board of Higher Mathematics, Government of India, and it has been happening for so many years. But Calicut University is also involved in this program because Professor Krishna Kumar, when he was there, this program was also organized in Calicut University. And even today in Kerala, it is organized. If I understand correctly, mostly I think the initiative is from Professor Vishnu Nambudiri, who's teaching at the University College in Thiruvananthapuram. So it is still there, and I think it's possible. Professor Srinivas is associated with MTTS, so he could clarify. I think it's still possible if Calicut University is interested to bring a version of MTTS to Calicut.
Yes, sir, we are really interested. Now we have the full strength of faculty also.
Yes.
So this year onwards, we have to try for that.
You could ask Professor Krishna Kumar.
Yes, sir. Yeah, he is always supporting that.
Yeah.
Srini sir, thank you so much
Welcome. You're welcome.
for your suggestions. Yes. No more questions? So if no more questions, I invite Miss Anchu from our students to cast vote of thanks. She's ready to propose vote of thanks. Anchu.
Good afternoon to all present over here. I am Anju Mulki of first year MSc Mathematics, University of Calicut. And it gives me an immense pleasure to deliver the vote of thanks to Professor U.K. Anandavardhanan sir on behalf of every participants present over here for giving such a valuable talk on the topic, the sign of Gore system. The teaching methods used by sir was really very effective and the topic was made very clear and concise. So glad that you have shared such an amazing pieces of information to us, like the importance of Gore system and how it has grown into a challenging theme in the number theory, about the concurrent problem, awareness about millennium problems, Riemann hypothesis, and about what is conjectures and the various conjectures, the BST conjectures, and other Indian contributions of Indian contribution to modern mathematics. Also glad that we all got an opportunity to attend your class, sir, and so thankful for your patience for clearing all our doubts. And I also take this opportunity to thank Dr. Preeti Kutipulekar, Head of the Department Mathematics, University of Calicut, and all the teachers of University of Calicut for arranging this national webinar so that we all got a chance to listen to the classes of such eminent personalities. Once again, thank you, sir, and thank you all, and have a nice day.
Thank you, Anju. Thank you so much. Sir, once again, thank you. Thank you all.
Shall I then quit the meeting? Is it okay?
thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Okay, sir.
Okay, so see you another time. Thank you so much. Medina, bye. So see you when I come there. Yeah.
Bye, sir. Thank you.
Say hi to everybody in the family. Bye.